is an Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering Charmed Life by Diana Wynne Jones. Chapters 8, 9, 10, and 11. In these chapters, Gwendolyn is gone, and in her place is Janet Chant. From a world that sounds a lot more like ours, and I have all kinds of weird questions and theories. Is this a companion book to Dark Lord of Derkholm? Or is it just like a Stephen King vague tie-in? Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everybody. I am Natasha. Many thanks to Patricia for commissioning this episode. I've been really enjoying this book. All of Diana Wynne Jones's books have been good, but for some reason there is a certain tone to this one that's really like hitting that sweet spot for me in terms of the kinds of literature that I loved as a kid. And I think it might be because it's got more overt magic, but also it's got two kids that are like orphaned and living away from home in a strange place. And that feels like the recipe for me in terms of British children's literature. The kids are not really at home usually. If they are, something like happens so that their parents are not there, or they are taken away eventually, or there is a place that they can sort of escape to that is outside their home for the major periods in the book. And this whole thing with Gwendolyn vanishing is so unexpected. I didn't know what to make of it. I reread this, and I don't usually do rereadings, but I started reading the next section last week when I finished coverage, and I was like, this is too much. I was planning to read the whole next section, and I reread the first chapter where we get introduced to Janet and everything starts to go wrong. And I was like, I need to stop, and I'm going to come back to this because there's too much for me to absorb, and I'm like completely unprepared. So when I came back to it, I reread that chapter again and then on to the rest. So Gwendolyn, to go back to before she has disappeared, she goes and gets her dragon's blood, which we find out later she has bought on credit. She has not actually paid for it yet. And she is just planning something that we find out later that it's like, really, it's so over the top as to be, it's the kind of thing where if you came down to it and asked her why, I don't know that she would have an answer for you. You know those kinds of people that just decide to do something shitty, and it's because they've gotten so caught up in the overall concept of making life hard for somebody that they don't really like question that overall motivation in the first place. Anyway, we start off with Gwendolyn going down into the village and Kat seeing how everyone's reacting to her. And I'm going to read this. Kat was embarrassed when they got to the village. Everyone avoided Gwendolyn. Mothers dragged their children indoors and snatched babies out of her way. Gwendolyn hardly noticed. She was too intent on getting to Mr. Baslam and getting her dragon's blood. Kat did not fancy Mr. Baslam, or the decaying pickle smell among his stuffed animals. He let Gwendolyn go there on her own and went to mail his postcard to Mrs. Sharp in the sweet shop. The people there were rather cool with him, even though he spent nearly 2 shillings on sweets, and they were positively cold in the cake shop next door. When Kat came out onto the green with his parcels, he found that children were being snatched out of his way, too. This so shamed Kat that he fled back to the castle grounds and did not wait for Gwendolyn. There he wandered moodily, eating toffees and penny buns, and wishing he was back with Mrs. Sharp. From time to time he saw Gwendolyn in the distance. Sometimes she was dashing about. Sometimes she was squatting under a tree, carefully doing something. Kat did not go near her. If they were back with Mrs. Sharp, he thought, Gwendolyn would not need to do whatever impressive thing she was planning. He found himself wishing she was not quite such a strong and determined witch. He tried to imagine a Gwendolyn who was not a witch, but he found himself quite unable to. She just would not be Gwendolyn. I had no idea what foreshadowing that sentence was. Trying to imagine a Gwendolyn who was not a witch, but he found himself quite unable to. She just would not be Gwendolyn. Now, okay, first of all, I'm acknowledging that there's not a lot of evidence here. But we get strong hints in later chapters that Cat has magic after all. There are a lot of things that he's like wishing for that just appear. It could be that Janet's actually the one, because sometimes she's there and saying what he's thinking at the same time. Like, you know, they're looking for something and she's like, oh, I wish such and such. And that's what he was thinking. But so it could be either one of them, but there's definitely something happening here. And this moment where he says he tried to imagine a Gwendolyn who was not a witch, we could read that as simple foreshadowing within the story, or we could read that as Cat somehow summoning somebody because he's thinking so hard about a Gwendolyn who is not a witch that they appear. I don't think that's what's going on, because Gwendolyn writes a note explaining what she did, that she left. But at the same time, I don't know, there feels like there's something there. So, the dinner party begins. There's all kinds of very important people. And they are arriving in carriages. One of them is a carriage drawn by 6 white horses, which is the coolest. And Gwendolyn, meanwhile, she was squatting in the middle of the carpet beside a sheet of paper. At one end of the paper was a bowl of ingredients. At the other crawled, wriggled, or lay a horrid heap of things. Gwendolyn had collected 2 frogs, an earthworm, several earwigs, a black beetle, a spider, and a little pile of bones. The live things were charmed and could not move off the paper. As soon as Cat was sure there were no more carriages arriving, Gwendolyn began pounding the ingredients together in a bowl. As she pounded, she muttered things in a groaning hum, and her hair hung down and quivered over the bowl. Cat looked at the wriggling, and hoped that they were not going to be pounded up as ingredients too. It seemed not. So she does this whole thing, then she adds the dragon blood, continues chanting, and eventually all of these creatures grow until they're like 5 feet. And one by one, squeeze their way out the door and head into the dinner party. The last one, the piece de resistance, is the pile of bones. There was a soft clattering, and more bones came out of nowhere to join it. The green and purple flames roared and rasped. A skull arrived last of all, and a complete skeleton was dangling there in front of the flames. Gwendolyn smiled with satisfaction and took up another bone. But bones, when they are bewitched, have a way of remembering who they were. The dangling skeleton sighed in a hollow, singing voice. "Poor Sarah Jane. I'm poor Sarah Jane. Let me rest." Gwendolyn waved it impatiently toward the door. It went dangling off, still sighing, and a second skeleton dangled after it, sighing, "Bob the gardener's boy. I didn't mean to do it." They were followed by 3 more, each one singing softly and desolately of who it had been, and all 5 went slowly dangling after the black beetle. "Sarah Jane," Cat heard from the corridor. "I didn't mean to. I was Duke of Buckingham once." Gwendolyn took no notice of them and turned to the earthworm. So this one is really, really horrifying. Guys, earthworms are just disgusting. I know they're totally necessary, super duper important to the ecosystem. I recognize that. They're excellent things to like literally buy in bulk and get for your garden and like put in the ground. They're aerating things. There's bacteria okay, they're gross. Don't care. And she blows this one up until it's like so long that it's just curled and looped inside the room. I want to read the description, but I don't even want to say it out loud, so I'm not gonna. Not bad, said Gwen. I need one last touch, though. Carefully, she dropped another pinch of dragon's blood on the flames. They burned with a whistling sound. Brighter, sicker, yellower. Gwendolyn began to chant again, waving her arms this time. After a moment, a shape seemed to be gathering in the quivering air over the flames. Whiteness was boiling, moving, forming into a miserable bent thing with a big head. 3 more somethings were roiling and hardening beneath it. When the first thing flopped out of the flames onto the carpet, Gwendolyn gave a gurgle of pleasure. Kat was amazed at how wicked she looked. The 3 other somethings flopped onto the carpet too, and he saw they were like the apparition at the window, and there were 3 others like it. The first was like a baby that was too small to walk, except it was walking, with its big head wobbling. The next was a cripple, so twisted and cramped upon itself that it could barely hobble. The third was the apparition at the window, pitiful, wrinkled, and draggled. The last had its white skin barred with blue stripes. All were weak and white and horrible. Kat shuddered all over. They set off toiling weakly, but were only halfway there when Crestomancy came through the door and Mr. Saunders came after him. In front of them came a shower of bones and small dead creatures, pattering onto the carpet and getting squashed under Crestomancy's long, shiny shoes. The apparitions hesitated, gibbering, and then they fled back to the flaming bowl and vanished. The flames vanished at the same time into thick, black, smelly smoke. So, Crestomancy is very angry. And this leads to him allowing Mr. Saunders to punish Gwendolyn. Now, guys, I'm very relieved later to find out that the punishment involved taking away her magic. However, initially, all the punishment looks like it involves is Mr. Saunders grabbing Gwendolyn, putting her over his knee, and spanking her with his shoe. Which is just the most antiquated, silly, awful, incredibly uncomfortable thing I've ever heard. I can't handle the spanking of a child that's as old as Gwendolyn without turning it into a perverse, horrible thing that, especially when it's a man spanking a young girl. This just was very awkward and terrible. I know that, based on what we've seen of Mr. Saunders, that this is not who he is. Doesn't matter. I can't help it. And it just made me so, icked out. I hated it. Then Crestomancy goes up to Kat and boxes his ears. And Kat's like, what the fuck? I didn't do anything. And Crestomancy says, that's why I hit you. You didn't try to stop her, did you? What the fuck, dude? What is that about? Didn't try to stop her. This bitch is nuts. She could have sicked one of these things on him. Why would he try and stop her? Crestomancy, what are you doing? I can't help but think there's something going on with that. I don't know. Boxed Kat's ears twice on each side. Kat was so surprised he would have fallen over had not Crestomancy hit the other side of his head each time and brought him upright again. What? Is it possible that that isn't what it looked like and that was Crestomancy, giving Kat Gwen's magic? And that's why he's able to do stuff now? I don't understand. Because I don't want to believe that he just hit Kat because he didn't stop his sister. That's just so ridiculous. I'm so mad. Okay. Anyway. Crestomancy went over and poked at her with his shiny foot. Stop it. Get up and behave yourself. You thoroughly deserved that spanking, and as you probably realize, Michael has taken away your witchcraft, too. You're not a witch any longer. In future, you are not going to work one spell unless you can prove to both of us that you are not going to do mischief with it. Is that clear? So Gwen is, of course, really upset and swearing to do something. And Kat's like, what are you going to do, though? You aren't able to do witchcraft right now. Because that's my main question, is somehow he wakes up and she's gone, and she says that she did it by her own hand, but she's not able to do magic. So how? How could she possibly? He opened his eyes on the snowy silence of the castle and was suddenly convinced that Gwendolyn had done something else. He had no idea what made him so sure. He thought he was probably imagining. So he goes and looks out the window and is keeping on alert as he heads over to her room to see if there's anything in the hall. There's all kinds of warnings that he's waiting for. And when he walks in, it seems like Gwendolyn is just asleep. And then she wakes up and looks at him, and he can tell right away that something isn't right. And there's a moment where she doesn't seem to know who he is. And there's a line that says, Kat realized that when witches lost their witchcraft, they also lost their memories. Kat realized means that he is assuming this in this moment, right? Not that he remembers that he was told this once before. This is something that he has decided must be a side effect, is what I'm assuming. So he tries to be really patient with her and explain who he is. And she's not getting it. And then he finally realizes it's not Gwendolyn. She looks a lot like her. But there are expressions on her face that Gwen never had. Her hair's too long. She's a little thinner. Excuse me. My allergies are so bad today, guys. I'm sorry. And he blurts out, "You're not Gwendolyn." And she says, "What a dreadful name. I should hope not. I'm Janet Chant." And he's like, "No shit. My name's Chant too." And they start to compare notes a little bit here. And she wants to know, obviously, where she is, what the hell happened. And it's very clear that she's a much better tempered person than Gwendolyn was. She also does not seem to be a witch. It's unclear to me. Obviously, her world doesn't seem to have magic in it. So I don't know if she comes into this world that she will have magic, if that is how that works, or if she is the same exact person she was here, and doesn't have it here either. Because you know how it's sort of the thing that's on my mind with this is in his Dark Materials trilogy. At one point, a person from our world goes into Lyra's world, and his daemon appears. He doesn't have one in our world, but he does when he goes into hers. So that's the kind of thing that's sort of on my mind with something like this. I'm terrified of Crestomancy already, but did they really take away her magic? How did she manage to do this if they did? I don't understand that either, Kat said. By now he would have given his little finger for a word from Gwendolyn, any kind of word. He felt horribly lonely. And she says that she woke up in the bath. I felt as if I'd been dragged through a hedge backwards and I'd no clothes on, so I was freezing. And I wandered about pinching myself, especially after I found this fabulous room. I thought I must have been turned into a princess, but there was this nightdress lying on the bed, so I put it on. And that's mentioned a bunch of times, that she puts on, she put on this nightdress backwards. She puts on the clothes later that she's wearing, that are Gwendolyn's clothes, backwards as well. And if this is supposed to be somebody from our world, it makes a lot of sense, because all of the buttons and everything that run up the backs of clothing would seem to us to be impossible to fasten, because we don't have maids to help us dress. So, it's understandable why she would do that. So they're looking around, and she finds a bunch of Gwen's notes. She finds some money, stamps, things like this, and is just really fascinated by how similar and yet different everything is. It's obviously many of these things are parallels to things in her world, but there's a different person's profile stamped on it, or it's just saying things it's in her handwriting, but it's stuff that she would never have written. So let's see. She spread this is the spot where they find the letter. At the very bottom of the box was a large pink sheet of paper, all covered with Gwendolyn's best and roundest writing. I'm trying to find these. Okay, yeah. Come on, Gwendolyn, give! And saying this, Janet tossed aside the letters and in a most untidy way scrabbled up the remaining folders, papers, writing sets, pen wipers, and the bag with souvenir from Blackpool on it. So, like, again, come on, Gwendolyn, give, and then this letter just appears. It could be that Janet somehow summoned it. I don't know. She's got the same secretive mind as I have. Dear replacement, I have to leave this terrible place. Nobody understands me. Nobody notices my talents. You will soon see, because you are my exact double, so you will be a witch too. I have been very clever. They do not know all my resources. I really enjoy the misspellings in this. She spells it resources. I have found out how to go to another world, and I am going there for good. I know I shall be queen of it, because my fortune was told, and said so. There are hundreds of other worlds, only some are nicer than others. They are formed when there is a big event in history, like a battle or an earthquake, when the result can be two or more quite different things. Both those things happen, but they cannot exist together, so the world splits into two worlds which start to go different after that. I know there must be Gwendolyns in a lot of worlds, but not how many. One of you will come here when I go, because when I move, it will make an empty space that will suck you in. Do not grieve, however, if your parents still live. Some other Gwendolyn will move into your place and pretend to be you, because we are all so clever. You can carry on here making Crestomancy's life a misery, and I shall be grateful knowing it is in good hands. Your loving, Gwendolyn Chant. P.S. Burn this. P.S. 2. PlayStation 2. Tell Cat I am quite sorry, but he must do what Mr. Nostrum says. So, Cat is kind of fucked up over this, and it's really interesting. I don't know how many siblings Diana Wynne Jones had, but there's a description here of him. You know, Gwendolyn drove him nuts. He didn't want to be around her. She embarrassed him a lot of the time. And yet, now she's gone, he's miserable over it and wants her back and misses her and is just really uncomfortable with everything. And it is so alien to me to feel both of those ways about a person. Like, to never want to be around them, to have them make you feel, like, embarrassed and miserable. And yet, when they're gone, you're like, what? Where are they? And, like, indignant and upset about it. I imagine this is something that only people with siblings would really understand, because I've just never had this kind of relationship before. So Janet says that she's not going to burn the letter, because as far as she's concerned, it's the only proof that she has. Now, it doesn't really seem like proof, because if people don't believe that she's not Gwendolyn, then they'll just think that she wrote this herself. But it's the best she can do, so I understand not wanting to burn it. So she goes and checks the mirror to see if there's something else hidden there. And when she pries the back of it open, because this is like a spot that she hides things in her own world because her parents are really nosy, it turns out that there's writing on the back of it. And so she's like, oh, damn it. We both have the same idea about things. But she put a spell on it that will allow her to, like, look through the glass and observe what's going on here. So they think. That's their theory on what's going on here. So, let's see. That was the moment when Euphemia opened the door. Janet jumped violently. She was much more nervous than Kat had realized. I'll thank you to stop pulling faces, said Euphemia, and get out of your nightdress, Gwendolyn. She came into the room to make sure that Gwendolyn did. She gave a croaking sort of shriek. Then she melted into a brown lump. Janet's hands went over her mouth. She and Kat stared in horror as the brown lump that had been Euphemia grew smaller and smaller. When it was about 3 inches high, it stopped shrinking and put out large webbed feet. On these webbed feet, it crawled forward and stared at them reproachfully out of protruding yellowish eyes near the top of his head. I have no idea, because the way this works feels like a security system. Like the instant that she walks in, she gets turned into this thing, and it feels like that's a reaction to her entering the room. It doesn't feel like... But this would have to have been put in place before Gwendolyn left and had her magic taken away, Or Kat did it, which I don't know how he could have or why he would have. Or Janet did it and she's just fucking with him. I don't know. Or is it just that taking her magic away has really turned her into a totally different person? And she really is still Gwendolyn, but she just thinks that all of this has happened? I don't even understand. But anyway, I don't think that she would have all of these memories of a whole other separate world if she were still Gwendolyn, but had just had her magic taken. Janet lowered Euphemia gently onto the towel. Euphemia scrambled around in it and continued to stare accusingly at Janet. Don't look like that. It wasn't me, Janet said, sniffing. Kat, we'll have to hide her. So they have to put her in the wardrobe. And it's really funny because he thinks to himself about how, like, you know, you would think that if they just, like, left her out that nobody would know. But when you look at her, you know it's Euphemia. Like, you can tell immediately. So he doesn't want anybody to be able to see her. And he hides her in the wardrobe, but they wind up finding her pretty fucking quickly because she won't shut up. She keeps ribbiting, croaking. So they have to go down to breakfast. And of course, at this point, Julia she has decided to be Gwendolyn's mortal enemy after Gwendolyn fucked with her dress and made it turn into snakes. So all breakfast long, she's just fucking with poor Janet, who doesn't know what's going on. Like doing things to like ruin, you know, like later on, she turns the soup into mud and makes all of the dumplings in it turn to rocks. She uses a knot on her napkin to like tilt the, let's see. What is it? She like pours something onto her. She keeps doing things to just ruin her day, you know? And, I feel sort of bad because Janet isn't the one, but I also like, Julia doesn't know this isn't Gwen. And Julia has every reason to fucking hate Gwen. And if this had been Gwen, I would have loved it the most. Like, seeing Gwen get pushed around by magic when she is unable to do anything would have been really satisfying, so considering how often she uses magic to fuck with everybody else. So at one point, Mary says, what I wouldn't give for a nice normal child in this place. But I am a nice normal child, Janet and Kat protested in unison. And so are we. Nice, anyhow, Julia said comfortably. How can you be normal? Mary demanded as she let down the lift. All four of you are chants, and when was a chant ever normal? Answer me that. Janet looked questioningly at Kat, but Kat was as puzzled as she was. I thought your name was Crestomancy, he said to Roger and Julia. That's just Daddy's title, said Julia. You're some kind of cousin of ours, said Roger. Didn't you know? I always thought that was why Daddy had you live here. As they started breakfast, Kat thought that this, if anything, made the situation more difficult than ever. Indeed. Yeah, so the fact that they're all related, like, I kind of low-key wondered, but I just didn't really, like, give it any, like, the fact that it hadn't come up yet, I just figured, like, I guess not. And then we go to the first lesson in which poor Janet is not, like, she has a completely different understanding of history because of her world. So she keeps getting asked questions about things that sound familiar on the surface, and she gives the answer that's true in her world. And Mr. Saunders is about to lose his mind considering how completely backwards wrong she's getting everything. At one point, she said, would you like to take my, because he says, somewhere inside that marble head, there must be a little cell of gray matter. I keep looking. Would you like to take my head apart and look? She asked. Don't tempt me, cried Mr. Saunders. He hid his eyes with one knobby hand and fended at Janet with the other. He looked so funny that Janet laughed. This was so unlike Gwendolyn that Mr. Saunders lowered his hand across his nose and stared at her suspiciously over it. What have you been up to now? Nothing, Janet said guiltily. Said Mr. Saunders, in a way which made both Kat and Janet very uncomfortable. So, a moment later, Mary comes bustling in with Euphemia the frog. And this moment, everybody is trying, like, assumes that Gwen did it until they remind Mr. Saunders that she can't have because he took her magic away. And he's like, oh, right, duh, I didn't even think of that. And then finally Kat just decides to be like, it was me. And Crestomancy's like, well, what are you talking about? I thought you said that you, like, he says first, like, you know you're not supposed to practice magic on your own. And Kat's like, well, yeah, I know, but I just assumed it wasn't going to work because they've never worked before. And now it has. And Crestomancy's like, all right, well, you're going to have to take the spell off. And Kat, of course, does not know how to do that. So Mr. Saunders, he pretends, it seems like he pretends to try to fix it. It's a really confusing thing that I'm still not sure what this is. Mr. Saunders began to mutter things. Still nothing happened. Euphemia's head bobbed anxiously above his bony fingers, and she was still a frog. Mr. Saunders went from looking puzzled to looking baffled. This is a very strange spell, he said. What did you use, Eric? I can't remember, said Kat. Well, it doesn't respond to anything I can do, said Mr. Saunders. You'll have to do it, Eric. Come over here. So he takes Kat's hand and, like, holds it over her and waits, and then Kat finally just says, stop being a frog and turn into Euphemia again. But to his astonishment, Euphemia did. Kat shot a look at Mr. Saunders as the brown lump grew furiously larger and larger. He was almost sure he caught a secret smile on Mr. Saunders' face. The next second, Euphemia was sitting on the edge of the table. Her clothes were a little crumpled and brown, but there was nothing else froggish about her. And of course, when Euphemia comes back out of it, she just starts crying, because I'm sure it's very traumatizing to be turned into a fucking frog. So this secret smile that Mr. Saunders had leaves Kat to believe later that Mr. Saunders was the one who actually brought her back, but he just let Kat think that he did it, or he let everybody else think Kat did it. I can't help but wonder if he's not smiling because he's realizing that Kat does have magic and he's, like, gratified by that for some reason. I don't know what that's about, but I kind of feel like Kat has to be misreading it. I don't really have any evidence for that. It's just my suspicion. So Kat and Janet basically get banished after this from class. Like, they're going to go back tomorrow. But for the rest of the day, they are sent outside to be alone. And they start to discuss, like, what could have happened. And Janet is also, like, wanting to know exactly what the hell went down between Julia and Gwendolyn to make her hate her so much. And when she hears the story, she's basically like, oh, yeah, well, that makes sense. Let's see. Oh, and Kat says, why is Crestomancy so terrifying? Let's see. Oh, when he saw the frog was Euphemia and went all mild and astonished like that, it froze the goose pimples on my back. I couldn't have told him I wasn't Gwendolyn, not even under the most refined modern tortures. And that's why I shall have to stick to you. Do you mind terribly? Not at all, said Kat. But he did, rather. Janet could not have been more of a burden if she had been sitting on his shoulders with her legs wrapped around his chest. And to crown it all, it seemed as if there had been no need for his false confession. He took Janet to the ruin of the treehouse because he wanted something else to think about. So this is the part where stuff starts to happen. Let's see. They talk about what's different in her world versus his world. That they have, like, everybody has cars in her world, and he's like, he knows what those are, but only rich people have them here. She asks if they have records or high-rise. She says long-playing records, which I wonder what that means. Or high-rise buildings or television or airplanes at all. I don't know what airplanes are, said Kat. He had no idea what most of the other things were either, and he was bored with this talk. Which, like, honestly, is so weird to me. I just don't understand. You meet somebody from another world, and they name a bunch of weird shit that you don't have, and you're not even a little curious. Like, I can understand in the end just kind of being like, well, what does it matter? But being bored by it is absolutely insane to me. She looked around for a change of subject and saw clusters of big green horse chestnut cases hanging all around them at the ends of the branches. The leaves there were already singed looking around the edges, suggesting that the chestnuts could not be far off ripe. Janet edged out along a branch and tried to reach the nearest cluster of green cases. They bobbed at the tips of her fingers, just out of reach. "Oh, dachshunds," she said. What a weird swear. "They look almost ripe." "They aren't," said Kat, "but I wish they were." He took a lathe out of the wreckage of the house and slashed at the chestnut cases with it. He missed, but he must have shaken them. 8 or so dropped off the tree and went plump onto the ground below. "Who says they're not ripe?" said Janet, leaning down. Kat craned out of the tree and saw brown, shiny chestnuts showing in the split green cases. "Oh, hooray!" He came down the tree like a monkey, and Janet chased after him with her hair full of twigs. They scooped up the chestnuts greedily. "A skewer," Janet moaned. "My kingdom for a skewer. We can thread them on my bootlaces." "Here's a skewer," said Kat. There was one lying on the ground by his left hand. It must have fallen out of the treehouse. "Like, okay, maybe it did. But Kat, you don't think it's weird that you swing and miss, but a bunch of them fall anyway? They definitely don't look like they should be ripe, but then when you say, 'I wish they were,' they are. You, like, I don't know. But then she says, basically my kingdom for a skewer, which is essentially, I wish we had a skewer, and a skewer appears. So, is it just him? Is it her? Is it both of them working together? I have no idea. They're playing together with these chestnuts, which apparently you can use for games. And Millie comes upon them. And so Kat has to kind of over compliment Millie in order to explain without explaining to Janet exactly who Millie is. So he says, "I do think Roger and Julia are lucky having a mother like you, Millie." Millie beamed, and Janet looked enlightened. Kat felt dishonest. He did think that, but he would never have dreamed of saying it but for Janet. Which I find kind of amusing. I totally understand that feeling of just being like, well, yeah, I mean, what I said isn't a lie, but I would never be acting this way, so I still feel kind of shitty about it. This moment, I'm gonna read this. Having gathered that Millie was Crestomancy's wife, Janet was quite unable to resist going on and gathering as much more information as she could. "Millie," she said, "were Kat's parents first cousins? Were they? And what relation is Kat to you?" I don't understand how Millie doesn't think it's weird that she phrased it that way. She doesn't say, "Were our parents first cousins? And what relation are we to you?" She says Kat and distances herself from it. And Millie doesn't seem to notice this at all. So either Millie low-key knows that this isn't Gwendolyn and is just kind of letting it go, or she just doesn't notice how strange that phrasing is, which I find strange in itself. And just as Millie says, we need Crestomancy here to explain, really. As it happened, Crestomancy came through the doorway in the garden wall at that moment. Millie rustled up to him, beaming. "My love, we were needing you." "It's quite simple," Crestomancy said. "Frank and Caroline Chant were my cousins, and first cousins to one another, too, of course. When they insisted on getting married, my family made a great fuss, and my uncles cut them off without a shilling in a thoroughly old-fashioned way. It is, you see, rather a bad thing for cousins to marry when there's witchcraft in the family. Not that cutting them off made the slightest difference, of course." He smiled at Kat. He seemed thoroughly friendly. "Does that answer your question?" Kat had an inkling of how Gwendolyn had felt. It was confusing and exasperating, the way Crestomancy would seem friendly when one ought to have been in disgrace. He could not resist asking, "Is Euphemia all right?" Then he wished he had not asked. Crestomancy's smile snapped off like a light. "Yes, she's feeling better now. You showed touching concern, Eric. I believe you were so sorry for her that you hid her in a wardrobe." "My love, don't be so terrifying," Millie said, hooking her arm through Crestomancy's. "It was an accident, and it's all over now." I really am so torn on Crestomancy. I've been trying to think who I would want to cast him as, like, if I were going to pick any actor, and I'd need somebody who could transform from being very friendly and sunny and attractive to terrifying in a moment. And there are so few people who fit that bill. The person that keeps coming to mind is Tom what's-his-face that plays Loki. And he's also very pretty, which I feel like would work quite well. But yeah, I just the weirdness of how back and forth he is in his moods is really fascinating to me. So they continue talking for a while after this about how sweet Millie is and how Crestomancy is just straight up terrifying. Oh yeah, you're probably muddled from having lived with witches all your life. Have you noticed how he always comes when people call him? He's done it twice now. Those two were complete accidents. He disguises it quite well, I admit. He comes looking as if it was something else he was doing, but... Oh, do shut up. You're getting as bad as Gwendolyn. She couldn't stop thinking of him for a moment, Kat said crossly. Janet pounded her open right boot on the gravel. I am not Gwendolyn. I'm not even really like her. Get that into your fat head, will you? Kat started to laugh. Why are you laughing? Said Janet. Gwendolyn always stamps when she's angry, too, said Kat. Gah! Said Janet. And that's the end of chapter 10, which was a really great ending to that chapter. I found that hysterical. So this is when they're heading back to the castle and they get sidelined by Mr. Baslam. So Mr. Baslam is pissed because he is still owed 50 pounds. And he, of course, has no idea that this girl isn't Gwendolyn. All he knows is that he hasn't been paid, and the thing that she had been going to use to pay him was the beautiful pair of diamond earrings that Mrs. Sharp found and tried to take. And it turns out that these earrings have a spell on them that makes them just shout who they belong to. They just keep saying, I belong to Carolyn Chant. And he says, this morning I had to wrap them in a blanket before I dares take them to a man I know, and he wouldn't touch them. He said he wasn't going to risk anything shouting the name of Chant. So have them back, young lady, and you owe me 50 quid. So he specifically says, wasn't going to risk anything shouting the name of Chant. They're known, apparently, like in more ways than I thought. And this idea of these, like your property yelling that you belong to a certain person is just wonderful. I wish so much that people could actually do that. It's great. And apparently taking the charm off is not only like risky, but it's also, you know, there's a possibility of like not doing it entirely right. The whole thing is it's done in such a thorough way that the earrings are not even an option anymore. You know, he's trying, even though it was apparently a Chant who gave them away. And Carolyn Chant, one would think if she put this charm on them, that her death would lead to them not being, the charm not working anymore. But evidently this kind of charm works forever. Because I just really expected that if, like, when I thought back, I don't mean expected like I knew the spell was here in the first place, but I would expect that if they belong to Carolyn Chant and she dies, that the spell either stops working or it's like bypassed by Gwendolyn freely giving them away as the daughter of the original owner. And that apparently doesn't work, which means either maybe the spells don't end when somebody dies, or Carolyn Chant is actually still alive, which doesn't feel completely out of the question, I have to admit. So this is when they try and set up like a payment plan with Mr. Baslam. they try and say, like, because he says, Cat sighed and felt in his pockets. All he had was half a crown. He offered it to Mr. Baslam. Mr. Baslam backed away from it with a hurt, drooping look like a whipped St. Bernard. 55 quid I ask for, and you offer me half a crown? Son, are you having a joke on me? It's all either of us has got, said Cat, at the moment, but we each get a crown piece every week. If we give you that, we'll have paid you back in 10 shillings a week, 52 weeks in a year, 26 pounds a year. It'll only take 2 years. 2 years was an appalling time to be without money. Still, Mr. Baslam had got Gwendolyn her dragon's blood, and it seemed fair that he should be paid. But Mr. Baslam looked more hurt than ever. You live in a place like this, and tell me you can only get hold of 10 bob a week? Don't play cruel games with me. You can lay your hands on no end of lucre here if you put your minds to it. So he says, all I'm asking is 20 quid part payment, interest of 10% included, and the price of the shutting up spell thrown in. That should come quite easy to you. And I will remind you that trade in dragon's blood is illicit, illegal, and banned. I've obliged you in it. You've fobbed me off. Now I'm telling you that I need 20 quid by next Wednesday. That should give you time. If I don't get it, and Crestomancy hears of the dragon's blood Wednesday evening, and if he does, then I wouldn't be in your shoes, young lady, not for 20,000 quid and a diamond tiara. Have I made myself clear? Suppose we give you the dragon's blood back, Cat suggested desperately. What would I do with dragon's blood, son? I'm not a warlock. I'm only a supplier, and there's no demand around here. It's the money I need. So, yeah, he bails, and this leads to them trying to steal a bunch of stuff from the house in order to go sell it. And, of course, all the stuff in the house has the exact same type of charm on it and starts yelling how they belong to Crestomancy Manor. So, yeah, it's not looking good for our fair heroes to get a bunch of money together quickly. Then we have the first instance of other people witnessing what's going on regarding Cat's magic. And I'm just going to keep calling it that Cat has magic until I know better. But we have Julia again, like, messing with Janet while they're eating. But every time that, like, Cat switches plates with her, it goes back to what it's supposed to be when it's in front of him. And I don't know if that's the spells limitations that Julia is casting, that when it's, like, directed at someone else, it doesn't actually work quite as well or at all. Or if Cat has some kind of power that he doesn't know he has that undoes it when he decides to, like, take ownership of something. Yeah, I'm very, very curious about that. They go to class again, and, Janet is trying to, like, sort of play stupid the way that Cat told her that Gwendolyn, like, doesn't know anything about the regular world, but she's doing it so hard that he feels like maybe she's overdoing it a little bit. And let's see. Oh, yeah. Poor Cat is thinking up all of the different, like, endings that could happen by either confessing that this isn't Gwendolyn, telling Crestomancy about the debt that they're in due to dragon's blood, but Crestomancy just scares him so much that there is nothing at all that ends in a way that doesn't wind up with him being, like, terrorized by the guy. So, yeah. So we have the scene where they try and, like, grab all of their stuff and run out. And when they come back, they run past Miss Bessemer, who I had completely forgotten about. She stood tall and narrow and purple, waiting for them to come through. There was nothing Janet and Cat could do but scuttle guiltily past her into the passage, where they put their suddenly silent bundles down on the floor and steeled themselves for trouble. "What an awful noise, my loves," said Miss Bessemer. "I haven't heard the like since a silly warlock tried to burgle us. What were you doing?" Janet did not know who the stately purple lady was. Cat had to say something. "We were wanting to play houses in the treehouse," he said. "We needed some things for it." He was surprised how likely he made it sound. "You should have told me, sillies," said Miss Bessemer. "I could have given you some things that don't mind being taken outside. Run and put those back, and I'll look you out some nice furnishings for tomorrow." Which is really sweet, you know, honestly. She's just trying to be helpful. So I had there's just so many little details in all of this that I find really, really entertaining. And it's great because it's not stuff that I would have thought of. I should have thought that the things in the house were bound to be as enchanted as the earrings were, but, you know, it just never even enters my head. And then we have the official dinner, at which point Julia messes with her chair and makes it like she's sitting on pins, so Kat has to switch with her, the whole thing. Meanwhile, and I'm going to read this, Mr. Saunders proved, at last, to have worn out his craze for statues. Instead, everyone began to talk about identical twins, and then about exact doubles who were no relation. Even Bernard forgot to talk about shares in his interest in this new subject. "The really difficult point," he boomed, leaning forward with his eyebrows working up and down his forehead, "is how such people fit in with a series of other worlds." And to Kat's dismay, the talk turned to other worlds. He might have been interested at any other time. Now he dared not look at Janet and could only wish that everyone would stop. But they talked eagerly, all of them, particularly Bernard and Mr. Saunders. Kat learned that a lot was known about other worlds. Numbers had been visited. Those which were best known had been divided into sets called series according to the events in history which were the same in them. It was very uncommon for people not to have at least one exact double in a world of the same series. Usually people had a whole string of doubles all along the set. "But what about doubles outside a series?" Mr. Saunders said. "I have at least one double in Series 3, and I suspect the existence of another in..." Okay, so they have to know. They have to know. They're not going to talk about something this linked to what is going on with the two of them by accident, right? Come on. What a weird thing. So, let's see. Okay, they switch places. Can we switch because she can't quite hear what you're saying? Yes, and it's rivetingly interesting, Janet gasped, shooting from her chair. "If you find it essential," Crestomancy said, a little annoyed. Kat sat in Janet's chair. He could feel nothing wrong with it. Julia put her head down and gave him a long, unpleasant look, and her elbows worked as she crossly untied her handkerchief. Kat saw that she was going to hate him now, too. He sighed. It was one thing after another. So he goes up to bed, and he's thinking of, maybe the things that Miss Bessemer is going to give them for the treehouse will be good enough to sell. Maybe we can use those things to try and pay him back. Then he sort of, low-key is maybe if I fall asleep and wake up, it'll all be better again. But when he wakes up, sure enough, it's still Janet here. And she's struggling to get dressed. Everything about this just feels so antiquated and awkward to her. At breakfast, neither Mary nor Euphemia were at all friendly, and as soon as they left the room, one of the curtains wrapped itself around Janet's neck and tried to strangle her. Kat took it away. It fought him like a live thing, because Julia was holding both ends of her handkerchief and pulling hard on the knot. "Oh, do stop it, Julia," he begged her. "Yes, do," Roger agreed. "It's silly and it's boring. I need to enjoy my food in peace." "I'm quite willing to be friends," Janet offered. "That makes one of us," said Julia. "No." So they are all sitting and eating, and Mr. Saunders comes in, and he tells Kat that Crestomancy wants to see him, and he won't tell him why. When he asks, Mr. Saunders just smiles, which I feel means that it can't be terrible. That is the end of that chapter. So yeah, guys, I'm just trying to imagine what the hell could be going on here. I feel like Kat's being set up or something. I don't know. Is Gwendolyn even real? Was she ever real? I don't understand what's real and what's not. Is Gwendolyn, is she in another world? I kind of thought for a second, maybe Gwendolyn went to the world that Dark Lord of Derkholm is in and became fucking Kirita, I don't know. But anyway, So these are, I have Patricia here in the chat, and the only thing that she said the whole time was mwahahaha, which I don't know what she's referring to, but I feel like it could be anything. But yeah, so I'm excited to read the next section and find out what the fuck, because I really I'm so bewildered. I have no idea. So thank you guys all for listening. I hope you are enjoying the coverage. Thank you again to Patricia for commissioning this, and I will be seeing you all again soon with a new episode. Toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.